Since 1978, when the Chinese government instituted economic reforms, China has seen incredible economic development. So along with this change has been the rise of China's cities, and skylines have risen across China virtually overnight. And yet, surprisingly, I think a little has been studied about what is driving such rapid construction of skyscrapers across the country. And so that this study attempts to sort of ask a few questions and investigate some of the causes, some of the drivers of skyscraper construction in China. The goal is to take a larger perspective, and I'm going to go through some of what I mean by the economics, from my perspective. Okay, so here's a brief outline of my talk. First, I'm going to show some graphs on skyscraper construction throughout China based on data that we collected. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean when I say the economics of skyscrapers. And then I'm going to talk about some of the economic theories that we've discussed in the paper and in the project. And then I'm going to talk about some of the results of our study. And then I want to conclude with a few remarks about skyscraper construction throughout the world. First, this is based on data that we collected. We attempted to find, we created a database, and on every skyscraper that we could find, where a skyscraper is defined as a building that is 100 meters or taller. So we attempted to create a database that included just about every building in China that was completed, completed in the country. The important takeaway from this is first that if you look in the mid-1980s, so the blue line is Hong Kong and mainland China, and the red line excludes Hong Kong. So you start to see some skyscraper construction in the late 80s, early 1990s, but the takeoff period in China was about, really started about 1994, 1995, and then you see explosive growth. So in the early 90s, we're talking about maybe 25 to 30 skyscrapers, and then by the early 2000s, we're talking about over 300 skyscrapers per year across the country. There was a bit of a retrenchment, and then there has been renewed growth since then. The next slide shows the height of the tallest building constructed in China from 1970 to 2014, or actually 2015. And even though there's a lot of fluctuation from year to year, what you can see is that the height of the tallest buildings, on average, has been getting taller, and the estimated growth rate is about 3% per year. So on average, the height of the tallest building completed throughout China has been growing at that rate, and there's really no technological or even economic reason to believe that over the next, let's say, 30 or 40 years, you wouldn't continue to see about a 3% growth rate in the height of the tallest buildings. So in short, China has showed a determined interest increasing the size of its buildings. This is the number of 200-meter or taller skyscrapers completed in China from 1980 to 2014. Again, we see that the construction of very tall buildings has grown rather rapidly. In 2014, by our estimates, 27 200-meter or taller buildings were constructed throughout China. So I wanted to see how that compared to the United States, and based on my count, in 2014, New York City had 3 200-meter or taller buildings, One World Trade Center, 157, and 4 World Trade Center. Chicago didn't appear to have any, and it's unlikely that other U.S. cities had constructed a 200-meter or taller tower in 2014, so that makes about 3 for the U.S., although there are a number of 200 meter or taller towers in the works in the US. So, in summary, China has embraced skyscraper construction, and the heights of its buildings are increasing over time. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that I'm probably the only academic economist at the conference. Okay, so I would imagine that the vast majority of you are in the private sector, architects, engineers, developers, and so forth. So given this, I would like to just take a minute here to summarize what I mean by an economic study of skyscrapers, as I think my perspective is a little bit different. As an academic economist, the key approach I take is to identify the various incentives that developers face broadly in regard to making choices about constructing tall buildings. So the identification of these incentives leads to making hypotheses about cause and effect. So this method takes a three-step approach to analyzing construction patterns across the country, and across cities across the country. So first is to provide economic theories, which are all pretty much summed up by some variation of supply and demand, as you may recall from your economics courses. Modern economic theory posits that developers are seeking to maximize their gains from construction, and what we mean by gains will be discussed shortly. After we itemize some of what we see as the key market incentives, the next step is to collect data. In this case, we've attempted to create a database on skyscraper construction through all cities in China that have at least one 100-meter or taller building, and we've collected data on various supply and demand related variables. The next step is to test some of the theories, the economic theories, and see what the data suggest about what is going on. I will also say that given the difficulty of collecting this kind of data, we've relied on publicly available data, and in many respects, this represents a first really, as far as I can tell, the first study of economics of skyscrapers across China, and so I hope that there'll be more studies in the future. Okay, so let me now turn to some of the theories that relate to their construction. Okay. Standard economic theory posits the following. Urbanization and rapid development causes land values in the city center to rise. High land values are essentially the high cost of land in the center of the city is basically a signal that many people want to be at that location. Developers respond to that signal by going tall. Well, from the perspective of the developer, the high cost of land suggests that one should build tall in order to recoup that cost. So from the consumer, or from the people who live and work in the city, they're saying we'd like to be here, and they bid up the price of land. Developers say, okay, the price of land is high. How can I maximize the return on my investment? So that's the standard economic theory, that urbanization and rapid population growth will therefore create incentives for skyscraper construction. In China, land is owned by municipal governments who sell the land use rights. But in theory, the principle is the same. In a market where land is privately owned, there's transactions in the sale of land. In this case, the sale of land use rights, the price of the land use rights should again reflect the demand to be at different locations. So that's what we call, that's hypothesis one, the standard economic theory. But skyscrapers frequently are not just large real estate projects simply to satisfy the needs for space. Because of their size and the resources needed to construct them, tall buildings can have other purposes. One is what I call signaling. The economic theory of signaling says that essentially that some might be willing to pay a premium to signal to others that they are in a stronger economic position than other people. For example, the height premium. It's pretty clear that as you go taller in the building, the rent or the sale price of the units in the building will go higher. Only some of that can be explained by the views. Not all of it is views, because if you think about the price on a 50-story floor as opposed to a 60-floor store, there might be a price difference, but they have virtually the same view. Another reason for the tall building is for advertising more broadly, to draw attention to a company, to the city, or a country. All urban land is owned by municipal governments in China, who issue ground leases for 50 or 70 years. Government officials, therefore, play a very important role in the land allocation and land use process. So the point of this is that, unlike, for example, New York City, where government tends to be, relatively speaking, passive in the skyscraper market, municipal governments in China tend to be more actively engaged, and therefore this introduces other possible incentives related to their construction. Okay, so let me see where I am. Okay, so let me now itemize the various theories that we have come up with that relate to incentives for skyscraper construction in China. Okay, so first we call the first one is just a repeat of what I said, which is the economic fundamentals, what I call the economic fundamentals theory. Skyscraper construction represents a rational response to urbanization and economic development. Higher populations and higher gross city products, for example, in theory, would lead to more and taller skyscrapers. So that's theory number one. Theory number two is what we call the municipal finance theory. The municipal government often rely on the income from the ground leases to fund government expenditures. Skyscraper construction, in theory, may therefore be used to improve the budgetary positions of the government if they're seeking to increase their revenue. Hypothesis or theory number three is what we call career promotion. Local officials are often promoted within the party and the government based on their performance. Skyscrapers represent a visible measure of leadership, and there's a mandatory retirement age. And therefore, this would suggest that those who are municipal officials who are younger might have the incentive to promote skyscraper development in their respective municipalities as a way to improve their career prospects. And I'm going to go through some of the data that we collected, but one of the ways to test this theory is to collect the data on the average ages of mayors and top party officials across cities in China. The idea that in theory we would expect to see a sort of a correlation between a negative correlation between the age of the municipal officials and the number or the heights of buildings. Okay. The next theory is what we would call urban advertising. As I discussed earlier, there's informational content in the tall building, be it to signal profitability of the tenants or the developer, or to draw attention to the city itself, to announce to the world that this city is growing rapidly and might be developing its financial sector, for example. All right. The next and the last theory is what we call the city rivalries theory. Since tall is a relative concept, cities may add more height or build more skyscrapers in direct response to actions of rival cities. The theory says, that basically the idea is if developers and municipal officials are looking around, they're seeing other cities add tall buildings for whatever reason, they might say, hey, maybe we should add more or make taller buildings in order to stand out and draw attention away from the other cities to our city. All right. So to test these theories, we created a data set, and we attempted to find every skyscraper in China that was 100 meters or taller. We collected this information from 5 websites. We also collected municipal level data from the statistical yearbooks, and we merged that with other data collected by either other scholars or other publicly available sources. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the details of the sources and things like that. All right. So, to test the theory, we looked at 4 measures of skyscraper construction patterns across cities. First, we counted up the number of skyscraper completions in each city each year from 1980 to 2014. We also looked at the height of the tallest building completed in each city in each year. We also looked at the height of the current tallest building, and then we created a yes/no 1-0 variable that took on the value of 1 if that city completed a 200-meter or taller skyscraper in that year, and 0 otherwise. The statistical analysis seeks to explain, and after we collected the data, the objective was to perform a statistical analysis that seeks to understand what fraction of these variables can be explained by the correlates such as population growth, GDP, the age of city officials, and so on. Ultimately, we seek to answer, is there support from the data, from the theories? Is there support for the theories from the data that we've collected? And so, in other words, is there a positive or negative relationship, a statistically significant relationship, or not? And if we do find support for the theories based on statistical significance, then the question becomes what fraction of the height of a building or what fraction of the number of completions can be explained by a particular variable. Okay? Yeah. So here are our findings. The first thing that definitely pops out is that if you look at the relationship between the skyscraper construction patterns and the across cities across China, and look at their populations and their gross city products, they are very strong predictors of height and frequencies. I would argue that they are perhaps the key motivator. So underlying China's rapid building boom is its rapid urbanization and is the growth of populations and income across cities. And I'll give you a graph in a second to show you an example of that. In terms of the municipal finance theories, we do not find any relationship, any statistical relationship between whether a city has a budget deficit, for example, and whether it builds more skyscrapers a few years later. So we do not find evidence that to support this municipal finance theory. Career promotion, we do find, interestingly, we do find evidence that when city officials are younger, they are more likely to build taller and more likely to build more skyscrapers. So we do find some support for this career promotion theory. Urban advertising. We find another thing that pops out from the data analysis is what we call the small city effect. We find that smaller cities tend to build more or taller buildings than would be predicted from the underlying fundamentals, from their income levels or their population. And actually, this surprised me the most. There is no evidence of widespread inter-urban rivalries. That's not to say some cities are competing against others, but we just don't find, on average, that cities, that systematically that cities are competing against each other. And here's just a graph to give you an illustration. On the bottom, on the x-axis is the population of 52 cities, and then on the y-axis is the height of the tallest building in that city. And you can see, for example, that there's a pretty strong correlation between how large the city is population-wise and how tall its tallest building is. And actually, the relationship is even stronger when you put this graph up for the gross city product. Okay, so let me now just turn briefly to global skyscraper construction. One thing we know is that Asian countries have come to dominate skyscraper construction in the last 25 years. Why might this be? Okay, well, I would argue that we need to know more. But let me just give a numerical example here. If you just count by continent the number of skyscrapers for each continent, you see that the Asian continent has double North America, over double than North America, for example. And then when you adjust the number of skyscrapers by their relative gross domestic products, in measures of their income, you see that that number actually goes up by almost a factor of 200. So there's something driving construction across skyscraper construction in Asia that is not explainable, for example, by actually either population or by income levels. So all I can do today is offer a few theories that I would argue need to be explored in more detail. But one thing I think is important is what might be just cultural differences. In the United States, I think people are of mixed mind about whether they want to live and work in high-rises, whereas here in China, for example, I think people are much more willing and interested in living in tall buildings. So all else equal, there seems to be a difference for how dense people are willing to live and what kind of density people are willing to live and work in. Another theory, I'm running out of time, so I'll just say conspicuous consumption. There's basically the conspicuous consumption or investment theory just simply says that some countries might have more interest in using skyscrapers to sort of show off or to advertise. Okay. And the last two I want to talk about briefly is government involvement. In the U.S., for example, governments are very reluctant to participate in skyscraper construction. They tend to take a more passive role. Here in Asia, for many of the reasons which I itemized earlier, governments are often more actively involved in the construction process, and this can help explain some of the variation across the globe. Now, the last thing I want to say is construction costs. Here's an example of 5 very large skyscrapers completed throughout the world. And the important column is this one. This is the cost of these buildings in U.S. dollars. And the One World Trade Center was nearly $4 billion. And if you divide it by the number of floors, sort of 37 million a floor. If you compare that with the Burj Khalifa, you get a number. When I look at these numbers, I think of, if the quoted price, if you will, for the Burj Khalifa was $1.5 billion, the idea of building something nearly as tall, 800 meters in New York for $1.5 billion just doesn't seem, it's impossible. And if you divide it by the number of floors, you could see. So the point of this is to illustrate the amount of variation in construction costs throughout the world. And the last thing I'll say is, so what I did was so the last thing is to create a kind of a skyscraper cost index. So what I did was I created the data on the cost of 200 large buildings that were constructed throughout the world, and then I looked at factors that would determine those costs, and one of the factors was the location. I grouped it into 11 regional groupings because 200 buildings is really not a lot of data to do more fine-grained analysis, but once you control for things like building use and height and so forth, one of the things that comes out from this is that if you compare it to the US, and the Middle East and the US really seem to have substantially lower construction costs. So all else equal, lower construction costs would be likely to promote more skyscraper construction. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you.